I got a note from my my sister-in-law this morning reminding me, said there's a fine line between a long sermon and a hostage situation. So I will try not to go too long today. I will go ahead and give you an upfront. This will be actually a two-part series. I'm going to get into part one today, and then we'll have part two in a couple weeks. But as I was getting ready for the planning this message, this probably started in the middle of December. So I was kind of thinking about the new calendar year. Of course, we don't go into and for all the celebrations that goes into it, but the reality is it's the secular calendar, which we plan a lot of our lives around. And so as I was thinking about the new year, I thought, what should we talk about? What should we study? And of course, I prayed about it and was inspired. I was actually very inspired when I heard Mr. Casperson's sermonette and realized that he and I were both focusing on the same topic, and I knew God had answered a prayer. But I thought it'd be good to start off with one of our basic foundational doctrines, and that is the Sabbath day, talking about the Sabbath day. It's one of our 20 fundamental beliefs, and it's by far the teaching that I get the most questions or comments from prospective members about. It's typically how people find us as a church, looking for a Sabbath-keeping church. So today we're going to talk about the Sabbath day. I've entitled this sermon, The Sabbath, a Much-Needed Rest. You could say part one behind that if you like. And what we're going to look at today specifically is honoring the Sabbath day. Honoring the Sabbath day. I want to look at just a couple scriptures proving that the Sabbath day is Saturday. I won't spend a lot of time on this. Of course, we have a booklet UCG puts out. There's probably a copy there on the information table, Sunset to Sunset, God's Sabbath Rest. If you have not read that one, it's even if you feel very comfortable about keeping the Sabbath, it's an excellent book to study to hope reaffirm some things, remind you of a few things. But I just want to look at a few scriptures very quickly to establish the Saturday Sabbath day. So let's start Exodus chapter 20. Exodus chapter 20. Referred to some of these scriptures in the letter last night, the Friday night email that goes out, Exodus 20. Starting in verse 8, it says, "Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall do no work, you, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male servant, nor your female servant, nor your cattle, nor your stranger who is in your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it." Sounds pretty straightforward, doesn't it? God worked those 6 days and then created it on the seventh day, the day of the Sabbath rest. He says on the seventh day he rests. This, of course, is being codified in the Ten Commandments here in Exodus, but it refers to when the Sabbath was created, or really when we're first told about it. And it's important to note that God did call that seventh day holy and sacred long before there was a nation of Israel or the race of Jewish people. It's not a Jewish thing. Jews keep the Sabbath, yes, right? But it wasn't created for them. God created that rest long before the nation of Israel and the Jews came into existence. Now, God says that day is holy and set aside as a time of Sabbath rest. And so really, we could probably just end the sermon right there and say that's all we really need as proof, right? But that would be a really, really short sermon and maybe a little too short. So we'll keep going. Matthew 12, verse 1. Matthew 12, verse 1. We want to look at a couple of things here. I really confused everyone in Charlotte last week because I kept saying Mark 12, and they had no idea what I was talking about. But it's Matthew 12. Matthew 12 and verse 1. Matthew 12, verse 1. Jesus Christ here, centered around, it says, "At that time Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and his disciples were hungry and began to pluck heads of grain and to eat. And when the Pharisees saw it, they said to him, 'Look, your disciples are doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath.'" Now, most of us probably haven't walked through grain fields in our lifetime, right? Maybe a few of us have here and there, but probably most of us have maybe walked through the woods or along a trail or something like that, and maybe there were some blackberries or raspberries, and you think, oh, well, that looks good. You reach over and grab one, and you take a bite, right? That's kind of the equivalent of here. It's not harvesting, but that's what the Pharisees, which was a very strict sect of the Jews in that day, were accusing Christ's disciples of doing. So that's the same as getting in, going out there with a scythe, or modern day, you have a tractor and a combine and harvesting, and saying, oh, it's the same thing. He's making a point here, and he talks about some things. He talks about David and the showbread here. And then in verse 9, skipping ahead, it says, now when he departed from there, he went into their synagogue. Behold, there was a man who had a withered hand, and they asked him, saying, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? That they might accuse him. They were always looking for something to really get him on, and it usually revolved the Sabbath day. Now, of course, if you go back to why Israel went into captivity in the first place, a lot of it had to do with the fact that they had a tough time. Well, one, they couldn't seem to stay away from idols, but two, they kept falling away from all of God's commandments, including the Sabbath day. So they had kind of set up their own laws, their own barriers, their own protection. And so they were always trying to get him on the Sabbath, it seems. Verse 11, it says, when he said to them, what man is it there among you who has one sheep, and if it falls into the pit on the Sabbath, will not lay hold of it and lift it out? Of how much more value then is a man than sheep? Therefore it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. Then he said to the man, stretch out your hand. He stretched it out, and it was restored as whole as the other. So what's going on here is arguments about what can or can't be done on the Sabbath day. Now, these were Jews, but again, as I said before, the Sabbath wasn't created for the Jews. However, the Jews did and do faithfully keep the Sabbath. So there's no doubt this would have been seventh-day Sabbath. Jesus Christ was keeping the Sabbath day. There was no question about when it was or whether to keep it. The question was about what to do and not to do. One more point here. Acts 17, I believe this may have been referenced in the sermonette as well, and I believe Acts 16 was, but I think we'll look at Acts 17, starting in verse 1. Acts 17, starting in verse 1. It says, now when they had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a synagogue of the Jews. Again, right, this is where the Jews would have been, what they would have been doing every week. When would they have been doing it? Verse 2, then Paul, as his custom was, went to them, and for 3 Sabbaths reasoned with them from the Scriptures, explaining and demonstrating that the Christ had to suffer and rise again from the dead, and saying, this Jesus, whom I preach to you, is the Christ. And some of them were persuaded, and a great multitude of the devout Greeks and not a few of the leading women joined Paul and Silas. Again, Paul's message here was preaching Jesus Christ. It wasn't a question on when they should be going to church, was it? It was on the Sabbath day. Now, some people, a more modern argument that they will try to propose is that, well, actually, Monday's the first day of the week, and that pushes Sunday out to the 7th day. So basically, instead of starting the week on Sunday, they start on Monday, and they shift it so the 7th day becomes Sunday on that calendar. This is more common in Europe. There was a kind of a push to do this in the U.S. a few years ago. Never really went anywhere, thank goodness. A lot of companies even will still sort of, when they do their production planning and they assign a number to a day, they might assign Monday as day 1 because their normal work week is Monday through Friday. But at any rate, some will try to change that. Now, one of the reasons that we know that's not true, as Romans 3 reminds us, is that one of the things that the Jews were responsible for were keeping the oracles of God, and that would include the calendar. So they, although it differs from what our calendar is in terms of year and what the months are called, the days of the week, Sunday through Saturday line up. But I want to read something here from UMC.org. UMC, that's United Methodist Church.org. The Methodist is one of the largest denominations, certainly here in the Southeast, primarily Protestant here in the Southeast, Methodist and Baptist. And UMC says this about the Sabbath day. It says Sabbath, or Shabbat, is a Hebrew word meaning seventh. The seventh day for both Jewish and Christian people is Saturday. Sabbath, the seventh day, is the day of rest for observant Jews. So here you have a Sunday-keeping organization says, yes, Saturday is the seventh day. They don't even try to argue that. The article continues. It says, for United Methodists and other Christians, Sunday is the Lord's Day. And I don't understand what that means. Typically, when we read about the Lord's Day in the Bible, it's talking about the Day of Judgment or Day of the Lord. It says, Sunday is the Lord's Day, the day of Christian worship. Sabbath remains, as it has always been, the seventh day, the day of rest for observant Jews. So they go on to explain why you don't need to keep the seventh day, but they don't argue that Saturday is the seventh day. There's really not an argument out there. They get some other things wrong, but again, they acknowledge that Saturday is the seventh day. So the Bible consistently shows that the Sabbath is on the seventh day. Not only did God rest in that day of creation, that week of creation, but we see it observed, Saturday Sabbath observed throughout the New Testament. Again, I don't want to take a lot of time proving the Sabbath today, because that we can do and pretty quickly, and I think most of us have done that over the years. And again, just a reminder, if you haven't read the Sunset to Sunset booklet, it's a great place to brush up on that. But what I want to do now is begin to turn our attention on why the Sabbath is important, why it's important. We've seen when it is, but I want to dig a little bit deeper and talk about what exactly the Sabbath is. And to do that, let's go back to Genesis 2. Let's go back to Genesis 2. Genesis 2, and we'll start in verse 1. Genesis 2, verse 1. Says, thus the heavens and the earth and all the host of them were finished. And on the seventh day God ended his work which he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had done. Then God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because in it he rested from all his work which God had created and made. So here is really the first account where we see God talking about the seventh day Sabbath. We're told about the seventh day Sabbath. The word here for sanctified is Qadash, Q-A-D-A-S-H. For those of you who like to look things up, that's in Strong's Concordance number 6942. And it means to consecrate. It means holy or set apart. Consecrate, holy, or set apart. A very basic analogy that I kind of came up with was that of making cookies. Okay, you all know me well enough. I've been here long enough. My analogies revolve around two things: cars and food. So I went with food today. We've probably all made cookies, right? Imagine you are setting out to make a batch of your favorite chocolate chip cookies with maybe some walnuts in them and a few other things. I like walnuts in mine. The rest of my family doesn't, but I keep praying for them. Anyway, you make the cookies, and you know what happens, right? You have enough dough, and usually when I do it, you do the first tray, you make it a dozen or so, and the first ones, okay, maybe they come out pretty close, but they're not exactly right? So you adjust the temperature, the time, or whatever you need to do, and then you do the second tray, and those turn out really good. And then by the time you get to the third tray, they're perfected, and it's just the ideal chocolate chip cookie. And you're done with it, and you're getting them out, and you let them cool, and you decide, you know what? This one right here, this looks so good, it's so perfect. I'm going to wrap it up, and I'm going to set it aside for my wife when she gets home, right? Because I'm just that great of a guy. And it's so special, it's so nice, I'm going to set it aside for her. And now I really want a cookie. It's a poor analogy, admittedly, but you get the idea. God says the seventh day is holy. Now, he doesn't say that about any of the other days. Now, those were good when he talks about making man, when he talks about making, the animals, the earth, all those things. He said they're good, but none of them gets the distinction of being holy. God says, no, this day is different. This day is really different. Take the analogy of the cookie just a step further. What if that cookie was so perfect that you didn't even want to waste it on a mere mortal human being to eat it? So instead, what you do is you put it into a little, plexiglass airtight container, and you have it, framed or whatever to put on your wall, and you submit it to Better Homes and Gardens to use as the picture of the perfect ideal cookie. Now that's getting really ridiculous, okay? But again, just to drive the point of how special that day is. It's just too perfect, and I want it preserved forever. We can begin to get a little bit of understanding of how special the Sabbath day is. It's set aside to be preserved forever. God didn't say, well, I'm pretty happy with how the Sabbath turned out. That's pretty good. That's all right. Now, he said it's so good, I'm going to set it aside, and I'm going to say this is holy. It's holy time. It wasn't just a good day. It's holy. Now, just give a few examples of things that God considers holy. Again, just to give us some context of other things that God considers holy, have, of course, his festivals. Leviticus 23, those are all called holy. The Lord's name, Ezekiel 39:7, reminds us that the Lord's name is holy. The offerings that we give to God, Leviticus 6, verse 25, are holy. That's why when I see people who, wind up stealing from a church or something like that, I said, man, you do not know what you're messing with there. That's a bad deal. You don't want to do that. The law, Romans 7:12. Paul says the law is holy. God's people are holy. God's people are holy. Deuteronomy 7 and verse 6. 1 Peter 2 and 9. Those who are set aside in the first resurrection, the first fruits, Revelation 20 and verse 6. And of course, God himself, Leviticus 11:44, and then 1 Peter 1, verse 15 through 16. Again, you can come up with many other examples, but just to give you some context of the company that being holy in the Sabbath is with, gives you a little bit of a sense. So knowing that when the Sabbath is and that God considers it holy, the next question might become, what does he expect us to do with it or on it? Let's turn to Deuteronomy 5. Deuteronomy chapter 5. This, as you are probably well aware, is sort of a recounting of Exodus 20 here. It's, again, another summary of the Ten Commandments. Deuteronomy 5, verse 12. It's said just a little bit different here. There's a little more to unpack the way it's said. Deuteronomy 5, verse 12, it says, observe the Sabbath day to keep it holy, as the Lord your God commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall do no work, you, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male servant, nor your female servant, nor your ox, nor your donkey, nor any of your cattle, nor your stranger who is within your gates, that your male servant and your female servant may rest as well as you. And remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there by a mighty hand and by an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. So here we see it really expounded on. It's not just you. It's basically all those things that are within your power, your control. If you have people work for you, if you have a small business, right? You can't just say, well, I'm not going to, if I'm a plumber or whatever, I can't just say, well, I'm not going to work on Saturday, but I'll have Bill over here, who's my assistant, go out and do it. No, it says you can't do that, right? It says you can't do that. And then he gets into this about when you were slaves in Egypt. Now, one of the worst things, obviously, about being a slave is that when you're a slave, you don't get to decide what you want to do. You don't get to decide what you do and when you want to do it. As slaves in Egypt, Israel wouldn't have really been able to keep the Sabbath day as they should have. Maybe it even got lost to some of them over time and not knowing when it was. God knew when it was, but people could lose track pretty quickly. Now, I've never had to quote unquote lose a job over the Sabbath day. I did have to turn one down when I really needed it. I had lost a job a few months before. My wife and I were expecting our firstborn. She was about 7 months pregnant. I was out of work. She had already put in her notice. She wasn't going to work anymore, and so I really needed a job. And I had what I thought was a great job, and then they told me at the very end, oh, by the way, mandatory overtime every other Saturday. And so I wound up having to turn it down. But it's difficult when you have to make those tough choices. Now, when you're a slave in Egypt, you really didn't necessarily have a choice. But, it is a sign between God and his people. And we'll talk more about that in the second half of this series. But God says, do you remember that time when you couldn't even keep the Sabbath day? Remember how bad that was? He said, you don't want to go back to that, right? He said, remember this day and keep it holy. So in a very real sense, the Sabbath served as a reminder each week for what God had done for his people. And of course, it serves as a reminder for us as well, doesn't it? Egypt was a type of sin. Israel came out of that. God brought us out of sin, and each week when we have the Sabbath, we're reminded, we came out of a certain life, a lifestyle, a way of thinking. Now notice it also says here in Deuteronomy 5, it talks about observing and keeping the Sabbath. Observing and keeping the Sabbath. Well, how exactly do we do that? Well, let's use another analogy. This time we'll use that of a wedding anniversary, appropriately enough. A wedding anniversary. A wedding anniversary is something you kind of plan for, isn't it? All right? Something you kind of look forward to. You say, what am I going to do on this special day? When the day comes, you execute whatever plans you've made, go to a special restaurant, maybe take a trip, whatever it is. And of course, you work to make your spouse feel very special and appreciated because it's a very, very special day. It's not an ordinary, average Tuesday night where you sit on the dinner, eating a TV dinner, watching the news, right? It's something a little more special than that, a lot more special than that. Likewise, a Sabbath should be something special to us. It should be something we actually set aside and, look forward to each week. How we get ready for it. That might mean a lot of different things. It might mean making sure you get the car filled up, on Friday afternoon so you don't have to worry about all that Monday weekday stuff on the Sabbath. It might mean, I'm going to pick my clothes out, that evening, so Saturday morning I'm not rushing around just trying to go out the door and just kind of accidentally rush into services at the last moment. No, I want to be there. I want to be ready because this is a special time, something I really want to be ready for and something I really want to observe because it's important to me. It's important to me. We don't do this as much as we used to, as we once did in the church, as our custom. I've noticed we do it a little bit more here, I think, in the South than maybe where I grew up. But, Friday is the preparation day. Now, it's not necessarily a biblical mandate, so to speak. You will see where Israel did that, and you'll see references to it. But it's a very, very good principle, right? Now, I understand you can't get everything done, but if we can lighten up our load each week of taking care of some of those more mundane things, that makes the Sabbath all that much more special and hopefully cuts down on us scrambling and just trying to get stuff done so that we're, barely out the door there on time or like it was some ordinary workday. The point is that we look forward to the Sabbath day. We look forward to preparing for it, and we prepare for it because we look forward to observing it. It's not just a chance encounter that comes up at the last minute. It's something we know that's coming up each week. Now, the Bible records a time when the people had gotten pretty lax in regards to their Sabbath keeping. And that's over in the book of Nehemiah. If you want to begin turning over there, Nehemiah chapter 13. Of course, this is very interesting because if you understand the overall context, Nehemiah is serving, as a governor of sorts here over Israel, over Jerusalem specifically, after they had been taken away captive slaves in Babylon. So in Exodus and Deuteronomy, we're reading where Israel had come out of slavery in Egypt. God raised up a series of judges. They got the promised land first, of course, the judges. Then you had Saul and David and Solomon as kings. And then things started to go south from there where the kingdoms divided. And the northern 10 tribes were conquered, and the southern 2 tribes were taken captive over to Babylon. And now, in Nehemiah's time, this is after those captives were released 70 years later and allowed to come back and live in Jerusalem once more. So this stuff should have been fairly fresh on their mind as to why did you go into captivity? Well, it's because you weren't obeying God, including keeping his Sabbath day. So with that as a background, Nehemiah 13, verse 15, says, "In those days I saw people in Judah treading wine presses on the Sabbath, and bringing in sheaves and loading donkeys with wine, grape, figs, and all kinds of burdens, which they brought into Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. And I warned them about the day on which they were selling provisions. Men of Tyre dwelt there also, who brought in fish and all kinds of goods and sold them on the Sabbath to the children of Judah and in Jerusalem." So Saturday became a market day for them, a day to go to market, do the shopping, get things done. Now the men of Tyre were not, part of the descendants of Israel. They saw an opportunity to come to town and do business and make some money off all these people who are gathering there for the Sabbath day. And then pretty soon that attitude crept into God's people. They said, well, we're all here together. Everybody's, here. We might as well set up shop and make a few shekels while we're at it. So Nehemiah sees this, and of course, this is troublesome. He takes action. Verse 17, he said, "I contended with the nobles of Judah and told them, what evil thing is this that you do by which you profane the Sabbath day?" Well, profane is kind of the opposite of make holy. It's when you take something that is holy and make it common. God took something that was common, relatively speaking, a day of the week, and made it holy. And so the leadership within Judah, the tribe of Judah, was basically treating the Sabbath as an ordinary average day. Verse 18, it says, "Did not your fathers do thus, and did not our God bring all the disaster on us and on this city?" He says, hey, y'all remember why you went into captivity, right? It's because you did this exact sort of thing. He said, "Yet you bring added wrath on Israel by profaning the Sabbath." It seems kind of hard to fathom that this would happen, but it did. It did. That's exactly what was going on. Verse 19, it said, "So it was at the gates of Jerusalem, as it began to be dark before the Sabbath, I commanded the gates to be shut and charged that they must not be opened until after the Sabbath. Then I posted some of my servants at the gates so that no burdens could be brought in and out on the Sabbath day." So he actually set up guard to make sure people couldn't bring their wares in. "Now the merchants and sellers of all the kinds of wares lodged outside Jerusalem once or twice." So, those men of Tyre and that who were coming in to sell, seems that the first couple weeks it happened, they said, well, we're just going to set up camp. He'll probably change his mind, after a couple weeks. But he wasn't going to. Verse 21, "I warned him and said to them, why do you spend the night around the wall? If you do so again, I will lay hands on you." He threatens them with physical violence. Of course, he had the authority to do that as governor of the region. "And I commanded the Levites they should cleanse themselves, and they should go and guard the gates to sanctify the Sabbath day." And then it's kind of interesting here, the last half of verse 22. He says, "Remember me, O my God, concerning this also, and spare me according to the greatness of your mercy." Nehemiah didn't want to get dragged down with everybody else and judged for what they had done. He said, God, I'm trying. Like Merle Haggard said, Mama tried. Nehemiah tried here. He was really doing his best. But you see just how exasperated he was. Now, this probably didn't happen overnight, right? People probably weren't peacefully keeping the Sabbath, not working, being prepared and looking forward to the Sabbath the way that we all do today. And then the next week they showed up with jackhammers and chisels or bushels full of apples to sell, or set up their blacksmith forge or whatever they have. This probably took some time. This probably took some time for them to slide down that slope. Maybe they saw the men of Tyre were making a pretty good profit because they pretty much had the street to themselves in terms of the shop, because nobody else was setting up things. And maybe then they saw, well, you know what, there's Fred over there, who I go to church with every week, and he's going over to this, men of Tyre shop and buying from him. Well, I might as well set up shop and, make money if this guy's going to do it anyway, because you know what? Hey, I'm not actually making him do this. I'm just going to take advantage. So you can kind of see how it would go down that slope pretty quick. And while it might seem very obvious, the question comes up is where and how do we draw the line? What about other activities besides work? Work seems like a pretty straightforward one, right? But what about other things? Things that take us to the point where we're beginning to profane the Sabbath and treating it just like any other day of the week. How do we make that judgment? This can be a challenging thing. And for those who are first learning to keep the Sabbath, this is often the next question that comes up. They might approach me, write an email, call, or whatever, and say, hey, I'm interested in coming to Sabbath services. And if they stick with it, not long, the question comes up and says, well, I told my boss I can't work on the Sabbath, but what about fill in the blank? What do I do now? What about this situation? And we're given some major insight on how to keep the Sabbath day in the book of Isaiah. Isaiah chapter 58. Isaiah 58. We're given some insight here. Isaiah 58, we're going to start in verse 1 to get a little context here. Isaiah 58, verse 1 says, cry aloud, spare not. Lift up your voice like a trumpet. Tell my people their transgressions, and the house of Jacob their sins. Yet they seek me daily and delight to know my ways, as a nation that did righteousness and did not forsake the ordinance of their God. So one time they knew what to do, right? It says, they ask of me the ordinance of justice. They take delight in approaching God. Verse 3 is kind of God speaking for the people. He says, why have we fasted, they say, and you have not seen? Why have we afflicted our souls, and you have taken no notice? And then God answering this question back says, in fact, in the day of your fast, you find pleasure and exploit all your laborers. And we talked about this principle a while back in a sermon on humility. We talked about how God was calling out his people for merely going through the actions. They were fasting. They would go 24 hours without food and drink, right? But their hearts, their minds weren't in the right place. They were, in essence, just doing a hunger strike for either God to notice, or at least everybody else, in the synagogue to notice, right? And how Jesus talked about those who disfigured their faces when they fasted just for attention. And he says, there's more going on here. There's more going on here. You want to know why I don't listen to you? He said, because your heart's not into it. Your heart's not into it. Then later on, he addresses some issues specifically with the Sabbath day. Verse 13, it says, if you turn away your foot from the Sabbath. Now, that doesn't mean turn away from keeping the Sabbath, right? He gives a further explanation here. He said, from doing your own pleasure on my holy day, again, his holy day, not on the Jews or Israel's holy day. It says, from doing your pleasure on my holy day, and call the Sabbath a delight, the holy day of the Lord honorable, and shall honor him, not doing your own ways, nor finding your own pleasure, nor speaking your own words, then you shall delight yourself in the Lord, and I will cause you to ride on the high hills of the earth, and feed with you with the heritage of Jacob your father. The mouth of the Lord has spoken. Here he starts talking about doing your own pleasure on the Sabbath day. Now, this is where people, quite frankly, tend to start to get into some trouble in terms of the things they decide to do on the Sabbath or not to do. Might say, well, there's a really important football game on this afternoon, and sitting down to watch football, that's how I relax. So, that's how I justify sitting down to go watch this big sporting event, right? But the problem is, you can do that any other day of the week, right? There's football on Sunday to watch. There's other things. You could go golfing on a Tuesday evening. Well, not this time of year, but, in the summertime. You don't have to go do that on the Sabbath day. You could do that at another point in time. Does going golfing, does watching this football game, does this somehow bring you closer to God? Does that somehow honor and glorify him? Are you edified and lifted up by doing that? Or are you just entertained? It's an important question to ask. It's an important question to ask. If we start doing something on Saturday that we could have done any other day of the week, we are diminishing its value. We are making it profane, just as Nehemiah saw the people doing in his time. Now, that's not to say that on the Sabbath day you can only read, you can only come to church You can only study, fast, and pray. Now, there is room to do other things on the Sabbath day. Maybe, you're going home and there's a nice park by your house, and you say, well, it's a beautiful day. I think I'm going to go home, get changed, maybe make a sandwich, and take the family over there, and we're going to go walk through the park. We're just going to go enjoy this beautiful creation and spend some family time together. I think that's a fine thing to do on the Sabbath day. Now, if part of your routine normally is that you go to this same park 3 days a week, and you jog the trail in the park and try to get your 5 miles in a certain time, and now, instead of casually going for a stroll on the Sabbath day, you're packing up your jogging suit and your gym shoes at church, and as soon as you say amen, you're changed, you're getting over there, and you're going to see if you can beat your best time. All right, now it's a much different animal, isn't it? It's a much different sort of intent. You're not just going there to enjoy the Sabbath day. You're going there to pursue your own pleasure, to beat your best time, focusing on your own enjoyment, your own accomplishments. So what should we do? What should we do? Is there a line we shouldn't cross? Well, the guideline of not pursuing your own pleasure is a great place to start, but I've come up with a few questions that you might find helpful in making a wise choice. These aren't foolproof, right? These are just some things to consider. If you've got something that you say, I don't know if I should do this on the Sabbath day or not, maybe ask yourself this question. First, is what I'm doing on the Sabbath day just something to entertain me that I enjoy? Or is it something that I can draw closer to God and His people on? Is it something I could do any other day of the week? Could I not do this particular activity today and maybe fit it in some other time? When I do it, am I diminishing the value of the Sabbath day? Am I beginning to profane it? Would my boss, who I told last week I can't work on Saturday because of this reason, look at what I'm doing today and say, well, wait a minute, you said you can't work, but yet you can fill in the blank? Would my brothers and sisters at church be surprised to learn that I did X, Y, Z on the Sabbath day? Now, of course, we have to be very careful here. We can't necessarily use other people as our guide, but these might be some helpful questions for yourself to think about if you have doubts on what it is you do. At some point, you're going to have to make a judgment call, and quite frankly, at some point, you may find yourself even in disagreement with your brothers and sisters on what you might do. One of the examples that comes up quite often enough that we have a bit of a paper to address it, is eating out in a restaurant on the Sabbath day. The church has a paper. It's on the ucg.org website, and it's called Principles of Sabbath Observance. If you go to the member site and go under, I think it's under Resources, and look under Study Papers, that's what it's called. And what it's kind of framed around is that question about eating out on the Sabbath day or not. But it really takes a lot of time before it answers that question in terms of what does it mean to pursue your own pleasure on the Sabbath day. So if you haven't read that paper, you might want to. But I just want to read a bit of a conclusion from that paper. It says, "There is much to learn about the Sabbath. It is a wonderful gift that God has given us to use in worshiping Him. Generally, in our day and age, the tendency is to take the Sabbath for granted. More people seem to be too liberal with the Sabbath as compared to those who are too strict. The church encourages its membership to take the Sabbath seriously and not to allow so many liberties that the Sabbath becomes just another day. We must make better use of the day of preparation so that we avoid activities on the Sabbath that would profane the day." Again, that's from ucg.org under Resources, Study Papers. And again, the title of the paper is Principles of Sabbath Observance. If anyone is curious in regards to eating out on the Sabbath day, the paper concludes that it's not a sin to eat out on the Sabbath day, to go to a restaurant. But more importantly, the conclusion is if you feel like you can't go to a restaurant in clear conscience on the Sabbath day, then don't go. But also, don't judge your brother and sister who may be able to do it in clear conscience, and vice versa. And of course, if you have questions, if there's a situation, if you have something that comes up and you say, wow, I'm not sure if I should do this on the Sabbath day, obviously pray about it. Please don't hesitate to come see me or one of the other ministry, and we'll be glad to help talk through that with you. Now, there's another important aspect of observing the Sabbath day we need to consider, and that is, of course, Sabbath services themselves. Sabbath services themselves, what we're doing here today. Let's go back to Leviticus 23. Referenced this earlier, but I want to read Leviticus 23. I'm going to start in verse 1. It just dawned on me that I probably going to have to keep my beard until after I do part 2 of this, because anybody who watches this series online is going to see part 1, and then I look for part 2 and they say, no, that's a different guy. So sorry, honey, it's probably going to stay around for a couple more weeks. I was telling brethren before services that this is, I kind of grew my winter coat, for winter time when I was in Ohio. I used to like to deer hunt. I'd go up in the deer stand. It was cold, so this was kind of an extra layer of protection. I haven't really needed it since I've been in the South, but it's been a long time since I've let it grow, and I just wanted to see if there's any white or if there's any red left in it. Although I'm kind of light-haired brunette, my beard actually comes in red, or at least when I was a lot younger, it was like red. And then over time, it started to get more white. And for a while, there was just one white patch right here, and it looked like I had a powdered donut. I missed my mouth. And then it started to come in more white, so I just kind of want to see what it looked like. But that has nothing to do with the sermon, unless, of course, you're watching part 1 and wondering why the guy in part 2 doesn't look anything like me. All right, where was it? Leviticus 23, verse 1. Leviticus 23, verse 1 says, And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, and say to them, The feasts of the Lord, which you shall proclaim to be holy convocations, these are my feasts. So we see all the feasts of the Lord listed here. Again, they are the Lord's feasts. They're not Israel's. They're not for the tribe of Judah. They're not for Jews. They are the Lord's feast. Some take it for granted and forget that fact. And sometimes even those of us who keep the Sabbath every day, or every week, and know that it's holy, sometimes we even lose fact. This is actually a feast. God says it's a feast. It's the first feast that he lists. Now, the word here for feast is the Hebrew word moed, M-O-E-D, and it means an appointed time, a place, or a meeting, appointed time, place, or a meeting. Not unlike a doctor's appointment or a meeting at work. If your doctor, go in for a checkup and you say, okay, Wednesday at 10:20 a.m., you don't just drag in the door at 10:20 a.m. You get there at 10:10 so that you're ready, and so that at 10:20 the receptionist can say, the doctor will be another 15 minutes. Bad example, but you get the idea, right? If you have a 10:20 appointment, you're there. If your boss, if you're still working, the boss sends an email out and says, hey, we're going to have a department meeting at 9 a.m. on Friday, you don't stroll in at 9:02. All right? You don't say, hey, you know what, Friday doesn't work for me. I'm going to be there for the meeting on Wednesday at 3 p.m. instead. That's not how it works, right? This is an appointment with God. This is an appointment. We're supposed to be there at this place at this time. Of course, we continue on here. Verse 3 says, 6 days shall work be done, but the seventh day is a Sabbath of solemn rest, a holy convocation. You shall do no work on it. It is the Sabbath of the Lord in all your dwellings. This word convocation means to get together, right? We actually get together on this day. Now, there are exceptions, of course, right? When we are sick, of course, we don't want to come and get other people sick. Maybe we're out of town traveling. Maybe there's bad weather. Last week I had to kind of keep an eye on things. I wasn't sure if we were going to have services in Hickory. I'm sure many of our congregations up in Michigan, Ohio, Wisconsin probably, canceled today because of all the snow that's going on. There are exceptions, but they should be just that. they should be exceptions. They should be rare and not happening week after week after week. Right? They are exceptions. When we miss a Sabbath service, we are missing an appointed time with God. An appointed time with God. Yeah, people who have the responsibility of renting the hall and maybe saying, okay, services are going to start at this time. We have an administrative role that says this is when services are going to be, and it's going to be specifically at this time, right? But the appointment is with God. The appointment is with God, and we should never forget that. Hebrews 10, if we begin turning there, Hebrews chapter 10, verse 23. Hebrews 10, verse 23. Should take a moment and say, hi, Mom. I'm pretty sure Mom didn't get the services today because of the snow. Oh, she did? Oh, okay. Never mind. Well, if you listen to this later, Mom, hi. Hebrews 10, verse 23. My mom is in Cincinnati, for those of you who don't know, and I know there was some weather coming their way. Hebrews 10, verse 23 says, let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who promised it is faithful. And let us consider one another in order to stir up love and good works, not forsaking the assembly of ourselves together, as is the manner of some, but exhorting one another, and so much the more as you see the day approaching. Some were tending to forsake the actual assembly each week, it seems. And the writer, who was probably Paul, is exhorting them and saying, this isn't a little thing. Coming to services, yeah, we're there to honor and worship God. We do it because it's commanded. But you know what? What can you do while you're at services? I can see you. I can hear about what went on in your week. I can connect with you. And if there's something maybe I'm lacking in, you can say, Dan, you got a minute? Or if there's something you need help with, you can say, Bill, you got a minute? Whoever, right? The writer points out is that if we're not actually at services, we're really missing an important part. We're really missing an important part. I mean, if you have to, you can stay home and keep the Sabbath day because you can't travel out, right? But when we're not there, we miss something. We miss the opportunity to encourage one another and to stir one another up. Stir, the word for stirring up here is Greek. It's paroxysmos. Paroxysmos, don't worry, I'm not going to put this on next week's quiz. But it means to stimulate. It means to stimulate. We gather together for a variety of friends, right? You just think outside of church services. Why do we get together with each other? Well, we want to see people, right? We want to have a nice time. Oh, yeah, I want to catch up with what's going on in your life. You want to have fun. And that's good. But, we need that special kind of stimulation that happens at church each week. The word here actually kind of is geared more towards the concept of provocation. Provocation. Now, a lot of times we think of provocation in a bad way, but sometimes we need to be provoked in a good way. So kind of an extreme example, right? If I would have never gone to church every week as a kid and continued to do so as an adult, no one would have never provoked me in the sense to say, hey, Dan, do you think you could get up there and give a opening prayer? And after a few years, hey, do you think you could maybe go give a sermonette, right? Or whatever. There's provocations in a good way to stir things up. And of course, from a spiritual standpoint, like I said, sometimes we have challenges. Sometimes maybe I'm going through a rough patch. Maybe something I'm thinking isn't quite right, and I need a friend to say, hey, let's talk about this, right? This is a very important thing to happen, and if we're not at church, that kind of stuff really can't happen. I mean, phone calls, emails, texts, video conferences, those are good to a point, and that's a good substitute when we need to use them. But there's nothing like a face-to-face conversation, is there? There's nothing like a hug. There's nothing like the body language that you can only get person to person. We need to be stirred up. I have a sourdough starter. Actually, I got to be careful. I can't say that anymore. I had to throw it out yesterday. But I had a sourdough starter on my counter at home. Every so many days, I'd add, flour and water to it, and I'd stir it up. And if I didn't do that, and I didn't do that for about a week, by the way, and it died. But if you don't do it, right, it dies and you got to throw it out. It has to be stirred up in order for it to work. It don't work when it's just sitting there. We have to be stirred up. When we begin to miss out on the Sabbath, we're missing out on being stirred up. And if we're not careful, well, we're going to die out too. Let's go to Romans chapter 12. Romans chapter 12. Verse 9. Romans 12, verse 9. It says, let love be without hypocrisy. Abhor what is evil. We talked a little bit about that a couple weeks ago, right? Abstaining from evil. It says, cling to what is good. Be kindly affectionate to one another with brotherly love and honor, giving preference to one another. Not lagging in diligence, fervent in spirit, serving the Lord, rejoicing in hope, patient in tribulation, continuing steadfastly in prayer, distributing to the needs of the saints, given to hospitality. If you happen to have a New King James version of the Bible, above this section of Scripture, it says, behaving like a Christian, right? This is how we are supposed to live. Now, how do we know what is evil that we should abhor from it, or good that we should cling from it? Well, we have this book, right? But, we also were given instruction through messages to understand what is good and evil. That's how God works through his servants. How do I be kindly affectionate and show brotherly love to one another if I don't ever actually see you? How's that accomplished? How do I distribute to the needs of the saints if I don't know what your needs are? How do I know what your needs are if I don't get to know you? I think we can begin to see how these things interconnect, how important it is for us to be gathered together on the Sabbath day. Verse 15, it says, rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. How many laughs, how many hurrahs, how many tears have you shared at Sabbath services? No, I can't count. A lot, right? A lot. It says that's what we're supposed to do. It says, be of the same mind toward one another. Do not set your mind on high things, but associate with the humble. Do not be wise in your own opinion. Again, how can we really be of the same mind if we don't really get to know one another? Right? And how do we really get to know each other? For most of us, that's face-to-face, person-to-person. As brothers and sisters, hopefully we feel comfortable coming to services, that this is a room, a congregation full of humble people that we can share things with. I've worked in places, when I worked in a manufacturing environment, that you go in and it was a free-for-all, right? Everybody was trying to get a step up, and there was no humility there. Only what can I do to get a notch up on the other person? We don't have that when we come to Sabbath services, do we? It should be very much at ease, where we can come here and we can share with one another, and we know we're not going to get judged or condemned or put down or stepped on or stepped over. And coming together isn't just to worship God. It's an important part. Something that we do when we sing. Something that we do just the act of being here, listening. We're being edified. But the fellowship that occurs on the Sabbath day is really what brings that body together. What we see then is that the Sabbath is very much a needed rest for all of us, isn't it? We need this day. I remember as a kid thinking, it's coming up sunset on Friday night, and I got to go in, I got to put my bike away, and I got to go do this, and I can't watch TV, and I can't play, all these things. Little time goes on, and you realize, is it sunset yet? Is it sunset yet? You're just waiting for the time where you can put things aside just for 24 hours or so. So, okay, I don't have to think about this project at work, or the leak, in my oil pan on the car, or whatever it is. The Sabbath is a much needed rest. Yes, it's holy time. It's commanded. It's how we honor and worship God, and we should treat it with honor and reverence. We should consider carefully the things that we do on the Sabbath day. Does it edify us, or does it just entertain us? Are the things I allow myself to do on the Sabbath day, are they beginning to slowly eat away, to profane the Sabbath day? Questions worth asking. As a part of the Sabbath day, we draw together. We come together so we can be more united as the body. We need that, don't we? So we know what to pray about for one another. We know what the needs of the saints are so that we can help distribute to those accordingly. And we can draw closer to our brothers and sisters, whether it's in triumph or whether it's in tragedy, because that's what the body does. Now, next time, we're going to dig a little bit deeper into what the Sabbath day means, specifically what it pictures in the past, the present, and in the future. But until then, for the rest of the day, have a great Sabbath.